we switch?
All right, group 6, take it away.
Okay, so we're doing the innovations of the 1860s. I'm Sammy.
I'm Sam.
No, JD.
So the goals of our presentation are to cover the 1860s attire and lifestyle, the innovation of tools, the energy production, military attire, weaponry, medical technology, and then the illnesses and injuries, which a lot of groups already talked about, but we'll cover more.
Well, first off, I'd like to say from the beginning, 1860s drift was not really that of Americans' own accord. It comes more from the Victorian era back in London, England, and a bit of France in a way. Now, as you can see here, we have some very different ways that you can wear, but I would like to talk about the women's attire, because foremost, they were the ones that were not only subjected to very chaotic lifestyle, but also were hindered in their own appearance and what they showed. Here you can see a hoop skirt that really shows exactly what women were also put through. Multiple hoops lined up with leather and or tape that would really show the silhouette of a woman. When you hear more, it seems to me like it's more of a parachute dress. And then in years' time, the silhouette changed because it took up too much of the sidewalk or too much space in some buildings, that they changed it to where the person would have more of a hump on their rear. And I would say this is the early development, not just in the women's shape, but in clothing of somebody like a badonkadonk. Next slide, please. Now we go into innovation and tools. Now we go into innovation and tools. Various things are made as a simple way to help. Like I would say, the drill bit comes down and made in October of 1861 by Stephen A. Morris. Now he simply just wanted to make a simple hole to pass a cable through, and he managed to inspire what we commonly know as the drill bit. Along with the ratchet in 1863 by J.J. Richardson to help in production of any nuts and bolts that may need put together. And you have the monkey wrench and also a diagram of the tape measure. Now the tape measure is very weird. You'd think somewhere along the line with clothing that somebody would need to measure something or anything of the sort. But until then, they mostly used a folding ruler. Now, this is a rendition of the American-made one, but it was originally patented in London, England by a gentleman, and all he had was just a simple tape measure that wouldn't retract. The gentleman in America, all he did was put a button right there on the side to hold it in place so nobody would really get their fingers caught. Now, I do have a question for everybody. What is two things that massages and a steam engine have in common? There's energy production needed somewhere for a massage. So a steam engine is a form of energy production. Now this is a weird one, I will say. Anybody want to guess what this is here?
Is it a massager?
In a way, yes it is. This is George Taylor's rendition of an 1869 vibrator. Now the reason why I correlated that with a steam engine is because you clearly see that it has a cord connected to it, so at some point somebody's outside filling up a steam engine with water just so his lovely wife can have a day. But he also created it as a weird direction of female hysteria, which they basically named it as sexual arousal. And this is his version of here, comb your tits. Next slide, please. And this is energy production. This is one that was made by Babcock and Wilcox in 1967. Now these folks basically took the epitome of steam engines from London and brought it down as a single standing, more efficient way to create steam and create power. They're still there today, and an interesting thought is these same people back in 1867 also worked with New York and the military on the Manhattan Project as a form of power needed to process the bombs. Now, I do appreciate y'all's time.
Alright, so the military attire, so for the Union, they wore dark blue coats, light pants, they wore a blue cap, and then they also had nice wool uniforms, which is different from the Confederate, because the Confederate, they had cotton uniforms, which were cheaply made because they didn't have as many materials. The Union soldiers also wore shoes that went up to their ankles, and they were called brogans. Their coats often had bright buttons that sometimes indicated the rank of the soldier or the state that they represented. So some weapons that were made in the 1860s was the Gatling gun, which was created by Richard Jordan Gatling in 1862. It was a multi-barreled rotating gun operated at a hand crank, and it could fire up to 200 bullets per minute. It was only used a few times in the Civil War, but it later became the first widely successful machine gun. It worked because it was a it had 6 metal barrels, and it was arranged in a circular rotation. It was mounted on a wheeled cart, and as the operator turned the crank, one bullet entered the barrel from the mag and rotated, entering the firing position, which when someone was operating it, it was like spinning in a circle, so every time they spun it, a bullet would enter in and then fire out. Also, the first U.S. Navy submarine was, used, I guess. So this is like an idea of what it looked like. They don't actually have the, what it actually looked like, because it was lost on March 31st in 1862 on the way to Charleston. Because of the bad weather, it lost connection with the tow ship that was towing it out to Charleston. Along with the crew and the entire sub, it sunk and it was never found. The French engineer Brutus de Villeroy, I think is how you pronounce it, he was the head engineer on the project, and the Union got the Alligator for $14,000. And then also ironclad warships were widely used then. It pushed out the wooden battleships in this time. The first of the ironclad ship warships was used in battle on October 12, 1861, and it was called the CSS Manassas. Okay, in the Battle of the Head of the Passes on the Mississippi River Delta. So the mini ball was also a big thing in the 1860s because it went from this bullet to this bullet, which it was coned kind of, I guess cone shape, and it was, the developer was Claude Etienne Minet.
Oh, it's French.
Yeah, it's a French name. He was the co-developer of the mini bullet. It was a conical shape made of soft lead, which was easier to load in combat, and it was made to expand under pressure to increase the muzzle velocity, providing a better spin and a better accuracy at a longer range. Also, the Colt Army model was widely used. It was a 44 caliber single action revolver. It was often a sidearm for cavalry, infantry, artillery, troops, and naval forces. But specifically, it was more, the Union got to use it more, just because they had more resources to get it and to produce more. And then it was produced from 1860 to 1873. And then rifling also came about. Rifling was created before the 1860s, but it didn't really like come into wars until the Civil War. And it was the most used model was the Springfield model, as mentioned in a previous presentation. It was the most widely used weapon in the war, and the rifling made the bullets spin out of the barrel, projecting them at a longer range and a faster pace. So the mini bullet and the rifling made the soldiers able to shoot longer and at a more accurate pace.
Alright, so now we got to the fun part, the medical aspect of the presentation. So I'm going to have you guys all involved in this really quickly. I'm going to point to you. You guys are going to be numbered from 1 to 4. And I want you to hold on that number, alright? So, 1, 3. Congrats, you just lost a leg. Next.
2, 3,
You lost an arm, sorry.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Another leg, man. Yeah.
1,
2, 3, 4. I'm 4, yeah.
Don't trouble, man. That's a leg and an arm right there.
Damn.
1, 2, anyway. For everyone that got a 4, raise your hand really quickly. Statistics right here, guys. That's how many people in this room would have lost a limb at some point had they been involved in the Civil War. Approximately 3/4 of all surgical procedures done during this war were amputations, which really puts into perspective. There's a lot of mismatching legs out there that have yet to be found. But besides that, you gotta look at the bag the surgeon would have been carrying at the time. It looks like something from one of the Saw movies. Like, you have a bone saw for one, a bunch of different probes that they would have used to make incisions. And as far as anesthetic went, as you have all heard today, I mean, it was around, it was recently discovered, such as ether, sulfur, and I believe the last one was chloroform. However, in most cases, you're probably gonna be crap out of luck and gonna have to like walk it off, ironically. And try to hope that like you wouldn't lose enough blood or like get an infection where you die from the disease afterwards. But if you were lucky enough to come across a stash of like whiskey or something, then hey, your day probably got a bit better after that. But not that much because you still lost a limb. So it is what it is. Next slide. Before I talk about this though, I just want to mention as far as like medical education went at the time, you have to keep in mind that most of these people were still practicing medicine from like way back when. Like I'm talking, I think it was the 1st century physician from Rome, Galen, who like proposed a theory of there being like 4 different liquids inside your body.
4 phlegms.
4, there you go. Which I remember correctly were like red bile, black bile, yellow bile, and then phlegm, I believe, or mucus. But my point is that because that was a theory at the time, it was believed that if you got sick, it's because one of these things was out of whack. So that's why bloodletting and a bunch of other wonky things were like really common at the time. And as far as like washing your hands, for the doctors, you can forget that. And they were the different patient at the time, especially in the Civil War. Same knife, same hands, just gonna go in there. This time is money, as they say. There's another patient's been that. But regardless, germ theory was a radical new idea at the time coming in. However, as I mentioned previously, it wasn't widely accepted because most doctors at the time, you know, have been in the rhythm of doing the same thing for a while. They didn't want to change, but in the aspect of things, as things went on, it was adapted, which is why today, I'm sure as everyone in this room is thankful as me, we're alive in the 21st century with modern medicine where if you get a cut, it's just a Band-Aid, you don't have to worry about losing your finger or something. But for the unfortunate souls that were on the battlefield during the Civil War, these are just a few of the diseases that would take most of their lives. Like, as again, you've heard, it wasn't really bullets that kill most people, it was the diseases in the camps, it was the infections that would be caused from bad practices with hygiene, from poor treatment of the wounds. And in general, since a lot of people that have vaccines for these things, I mean, if somebody coughed on you, you're kind of screwed, you're like, no joke. But besides that, I wouldn't necessarily call these popular, but you know, they were definitely common. Sorry, man, but all in all, it was a different time to be alive in, but it led to the practices we have today. So if there's one thing you guys can take from my side of the presentation here, please guys, wash your hands.
All right.
Okay, question. So Sammy, I have to correct you on your submarine. Remember I told you guys the story of the Hunley. I just looked it up to double check my facts, but in Charleston you can see the Hunley. So in 1995 they found it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it had been preserved very well in the water, and so it's still in water, and you can visit it. It was not open the day I was in Charleston. I'm still a little salty about that. But yeah, it had been used twice and had gone down and killed 2 crews full of people. And the second one, it killed the inventor, Hunley himself. He was in the second one. And then the third one was when it was lost. And, but yeah, they found it, so you can now see it.
Well, I read like every trial that they did,
Yeah.
and not a lot of them were sunk or
Yeah.
they didn't make it through.
And they just bring it up,
Yep.
clean it out, and send it back down. And they just hadn't gotten the air or the oxygen thing.
Yeah, and they would just send it back to like, the, engineer, and then
Yeah.
they would redo stuff.
I would hate to be one of those testers.
I know.
Like, we have no idea if this thing is gonna sink, float.
But if the inventor, the engineer who invented it, Hunley himself, was willing to go down it, he was, the second time, he was pretty confident.
That's a matter of-
That's called
Yeah,
or
that's a-
pretty confident.
Yeah, that's
The
a matter
first
of Dr.
commander
Jekyll
was,
and Mr. Hyde.
Samuel
I give them
Eakins.
that.
Okay.
But there was like 3 other guys before that were running the ship, but they weren't really announced because they lost their lives.
Right, yeah, it's fascinating, just the
I got a
idea.
question. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you said we had the hoop skirt first, right? And then did we invent like the butt?
Well, to a degree, it came over time as anything changed. Even so, the language changed as well. You can see the difference. But no, we more or less acquainted a lot of what Southern culture was from everyone else and just reinvented it and gave an arrogance about it.
Think of like New Orleans being a pretty heavy French port.
Mhm.
It was very fluent in French culture, and so most things were inherited from there. That's where you get a lot of the hoop skirts and buns. Also, hoop skirts are not that bad. I would just like it stated.
No.
They're completely manageable to walk around in.
But they do take up a lot of space, so
That was-
that.
You have, when you sit, you just gotta go with it and then sit, and then it goes whoop.
No, they were more or less like the daily use of it, because just walking down the street with 2 people, you're
Yeah.
taking up more than just for one person.
Especially 2 women.
And that was more the deal, because after a while, instead of going outward, they started to come back and up with the actual way the dress actually
Right,
sat.
so that's my question, like, did that come from us, or did that come from somewhere
It
else?
came from somewhere else,
It
because you have to, this is a sense of passion, and I think there was a war going on, so I don't really think somebody's going, you got blood on my best shirt. So to a degree, when they said that women were excluded due to age and certain things on their clothing itself, that also showed that they were also, like, they had to have some type of formal dress, because granted, the Civil War was a modern war to an extent, but it was still the old gentleman way of
Oh, yeah.
war.
Sure.
And that's where you get a lot of the society, like standing next to, not only just being apart from the war, but standing next to it as, I'm not just having a war in my country, but at least I can still look the part,
Yeah.
which is a weird way to look at it, but the fashion itself, innovation on that end, that constantly changed from different aspects of the world, different dyes, different ways of textiles. They brought themselves about, and mine just kind of stuck with women's clothing, because I'm sorry, it's not a fetish, but it's the degree of how much we actually put in it now versus how we looked at it then.
Also, you didn't have industrialized clothing yet, really, so
Right.
most
Yeah.
goods were still handmade.
Yeah.
Instead of, you didn't get that until the 80s, 90s.
On that note, something I
Sure.
think that is cool that I didn't actually hear any other groups talk about is that right before the Civil War, we had the like first factories in America, which is what allowed us to do things like machine rifling. Before that, like a good gun broke, you were like, shit, I just have to go get a whole new gun now. We had just started producing weapons on like a massive scale where if something broke, you could just order another part.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you need a whole blacksmith.
It was like the first war that was ever the case.
Well, yeah, I was gonna ask this question for the other group who was actually like mainly on the guns, but like in the beginning of the war, were the guns scarce? Like, cause I don't know if like how well prepared either side were for actually going to war.
I mean, at the beginning they were kind of scarce, but after a few weeks or I won't say months or years, since the production started increasing, there was a wider range of weaponry that was dispersed. But in like the first few months, it was pretty scarce to find like good quality weapons.
There also wasn't a lot of combat going on in the first official few months. It was more of just like training and everybody getting things together.
Yeah.
That's why the first Gatling gun wasn't used in the war until 61.